About a year ago, France, and specifically its precarious fiscal position, was the centre of attention. Successive prime ministers appointed by President Emmanuel Macron, who lacks a majority in parliament, had been trying to balance the budget, sparking speculation about snap elections or possibly even Macron's resignation. France's apparent inability to balance its books had provoked some nervousness in the bond markets, with French bond yields, that is, the interest rate that France has to offer to find new buyers for its debt, surpassing Italy's in September of last year, something that would have been unthinkable only a few years ago. The government was eventually able to force a budget through in February via the controversial Article 49(3) of the Constitution, which allows the government to pass legislation without a vote from MPs, and yields subsequently stabilised. However, in the past couple of weeks, and without anyone really noticing, French bond yields have suddenly surged to multi-decade highs. So, in this video, we're going to explain why French borrowing costs are surging, why they don't look likely to come down anytime soon, and why France could thus be sleepwalking into a really quite acute debt crisis. Europe is working towards an ever closer union, but member nations still have the right to veto decisions they don't like. Our new issue of the Too Long magazine has a multi-page explainer about why the EU's veto system could be holding it back. That's just one of the articles in our longest issue ever. Subscribe to get your copy by clicking the link in the description. So let's start by looking at what's happening in the French bond markets, where most of the movement has come at what's known as the long end of the curve. In other words, long-dated debt that doesn't have to be paid off for years or decades. The yield on 10-year bonds, for instance, which as the name suggests basically reflect the annual interest rate that France has to offer to borrow money for 10 years, spiked to 4.05% at the end of last week, its highest level since October 2008. Similarly, the yield on 30-year bonds peaked at 4.84% last week, its highest level since July 2008. This rise in yields has in turn pushed up servicing costs. In other words, the cost of just paying off the interest on France's outstanding debt pile. According to a study commissioned by the government and published a couple of weeks ago, France is expected to spend 77 billion euros on debt servicing in 2026, up from 66 billion euros the year before, and representing nearly 3% of GDP. So what's going on here? Why are French borrowing costs suddenly spiking? Well, perhaps the first thing to note is that it's not just France. Yields are rising basically everywhere at the moment. Yields on long-dated American, British, and even German bonds have also risen in recent months, broadly tracking the ructions in the French bond market. This presumably reflects the fact that markets are becoming more anxious about governments' abilities to actually pay off their debts, probably because they've become more pessimistic about the state of the global economy more generally. This is most likely a reaction to the fact that the US and Iran have apparently been unable to come to a sustainable peace deal, which means the Strait of Hormuz is unlikely to properly reopen anytime soon, imposing further costs on global energy markets. However, while yields might be generally on the up, they're rising particularly fast in France. So why are markets particularly nervous about France? Well, the fundamental reason is that France has one of the largest debt burdens in the developed world, with a debt-to-GDP ratio of nearly 120%, and is continuing to run some pretty massive budget deficits. In 2025, for instance, France ran a deficit representing 5.1% of GDP, one of the biggest in the EU. But the reason that markets have suddenly become even more pessimistic about France is that things look unlikely to get better anytime soon. According to the most recent estimates from the IMF, compiled in July, the deficit is expected to actually widen to 5.2% of GDP in 2026, instead of narrowing to 5%, which is what the government projected would happen at its last budget. This is largely because the IMF expects the French economy to grow by just 0.6% in 2026, the slowest pace in 15 years, excluding COVID, down from 0.8% in 2025 and well below the government's original forecast. To make things even worse, 0.6% currently looks somewhat optimistic. France saw basically zero growth in the first half of this year, contracting by 0.1% in the first quarter and then growing by just 0.2% in the second, with unemployment also reaching a 6-year high of 8.3%. Furthermore, since these IMF estimates were compiled, the war in Iran has restarted, imposing more disruption upon global energy markets, and Europe has been hit by a succession of appalling heat waves that are expected to disproportionately affect the French economy. According to an analysis by Triodos Bank published last week, for instance, France could lose 1.4 percentage points of economic growth this year thanks to heat waves, more than any other European country, and more than enough to push France into a recession. Obviously, this is very bad news for French public finances, because weaker growth generally means less tax receipts, which, unless spending comes down, means a wider deficit. And, well, spending doesn't look like it's coming down anytime soon. This is in part because of familiar obstacles that impeded last year's budget. No party or grouping commands a majority in the French parliament, and no one really wants to commit to significant spending cuts because they're politically toxic to the French electorate. But this has all been very much exacerbated by the fact that everyone is looking to next year's presidential election, due for April, which has made French politicians of all stripes extra wary of proposing or agreeing to any politically controversial spending cuts, for fear of hurting their chances at the election. This was why, in a slightly extraordinary intervention during an interview to the Financial Times, France's budget minister David Amiel issued a public plea to other MPs, calling on them to avoid deferring difficult decisions until after the election, in order to give the next president and parliament as much freedom of action as possible. The big risk here is that the economic and political timelines don't match up. In other words, the French political class tries to defer any difficult spending decisions until after the election. But the bond markets don't have the same patience. Unfortunately for, well, France, the speed at which bond yields are rising suggests that things might well be headed in that direction. If this does happen, this will leave the European Central Bank with an uncomfortable dilemma. They can either essentially print some money and help bail out France, which would risk stoking inflation and upset basically every other member state, or they could hold the line, which would risk an acute debt crisis in the EU's second biggest economy, and stoke Eurosceptic sentiment ahead of one of the most consequential presidential elections in recent history. I've already told you about one of the articles in the next issue of Too Long, but there's so much more inside you're going to want to discover. So if you subscribe using code SUMMER26, you'll not only get 20% off every issue as a subscriber, you'll also get an additional £3 off your first issue, bringing the cost as low as £4.99 for a digital edition. And yes, if shipping, or increasingly tariffs, are making deliveries to wherever you live a little too expensive, you can get a digital version sent straight to your inbox. Plus, we actually earn more from digital editions, as we actually lose money on shipping, so it's also a better way to support the channel. This is a good first issue to jump on board with too. It's our longest ever, 84 pages, and it contains stories from all across the world, including Burnham here in Britain, the wars in Ukraine and Iran, China and the US's relationship, a bit from the Vatican, and of course the cover story on the plan to rebuild Europe. It also contains articles from our superb new writers Natasha, Isaac and Ebba. So make sure to use code SUMMER26 at checkout and become a Too Long subscriber today.